Viewer discretion is advised. Between 1969 and 1973, Ted Bundy vanished from the public record. Investigators later called it his shadow period, the years when the man behind the mask began to take shape. To understand what emerged, we have to go back to where his double life began. Ted Bundy's story begins not with violence, but with secrets. He was born in 1946 in Burlington, Vermont, to an unwed mother. To avoid stigma, his grandparents raised him as their own, and his mother was introduced to the world as his sister. This early deception would linger like a quiet foundation beneath his identity. As a child, Bundy was bright, but socially awkward. He struggled to connect with others, often retreating into solitary activities. He later described moments of confusion and anger regarding his parentage, though the full emotional impact remained murky. By the time he moved with his mother to Washington State in the 1950s, he had learned to wear masks: social, emotional, familial. Neighbors and classmates often saw two sides of him: a polite, well-groomed boy and a withdrawn observer, quietly watching others. During adolescence, he began committing petty thefts and peeping incidents. These acts were dismissed as youthful misbehavior, but they foreshadowed a growing desire for control and boundary crossing. The family maintained a surface of normalcy, but the early fractures in his identity had already formed. He learned to blend in, to avoid scrutiny, and to present whatever version of himself the moment demanded. This ability to disappear behind a smile would later become one of his most dangerous traits. By the late 1960s, Ted Bundy was the picture of respectability. At the University of Washington, he studied psychology, volunteered in politics, and eventually enrolled in law school. He appeared confident, ambitious, and socially adept. People described him as intelligent and charming. He made connections in local political circles, worked on campaigns, and dated women who saw him as thoughtful and attentive. This public image was no accident. Bundy meticulously built a persona that concealed his insecurities and impulses. He adapted his behavior to match those around him, mimicking charisma until it felt natural. Professors saw potential. Peers saw leadership. Few saw through the carefully constructed surface. In reality, Bundy was leading a fragmented existence. Beneath the polished exterior, he experienced periods of aimless drifting, theft, and obsession with power and control. Police records and personal accounts show he sometimes disappeared for stretches of time, traveling without clear purpose. During this period, there's a crucial gap in Bundy's documented activities, a stretch investigators would later call his shadow years. These were the years between his polished campus life and his first confirmed crimes, a period that held the key to understanding how he transformed from student to predator. Even decades later, what truly happened during that time remains partly in the dark. Between roughly 1969 and 1973, Ted Bundy's trail thins out. Official records show little beyond scattered travel, unfinished academic pursuits, and vague personal accounts. He dropped out of law school, moved between states, and lived what appeared to be a transient, unfocused life. But according to later interviews and confessions, these were the years when his methods began to take shape. Bundy hinted at early crimes during this time but offered few specifics. He spoke in generalities, as if reliving the feeling rather than the details. Investigators believe he used these years to test approaches, learning how to gain trust, isolate potential victims, and move without drawing attention. Evidence of unsolved disappearances and attacks in multiple states has since been examined in connection with this period. While definitive proof remains elusive in many cases, patterns emerge that align with Bundy's later behavior. Travel routes, timelines, and descriptions point to a man experimenting in the shadows. These years represent the bridge between the man he showed to the world and the predator he was becoming. When Bundy finally emerged into the public eye in 1974, his methods were disturbingly refined, as if they'd been rehearsed, and in a way, they had. This hidden chapter would become one of the most unsettling mysteries in modern criminal history. In January of 1974, the mask slipped. Within months, Bundy launched into a string of attacks that shook Washington state. His victims were young women, students, often taken from places where they should have felt safe: libraries, dormitories, and campuses. The sudden surge of disappearances puzzled investigators. Witnesses described a man who appeared clean-cut, polite, and sometimes injured, carrying a cast, a sling, or books he claimed he needed help with. Others mentioned he introduced himself as Ted. It was a tactic that played on empathy and disarmed suspicion. Once trust was gained, he would isolate his targets. As the year unfolded, the frequency of these crimes escalated. Police departments across Washington and Oregon realized they were not dealing with random disappearances. Something calculated was unfolding, but their suspect profile was difficult to reconcile. No one imagined the well-dressed law student and political volunteer could be the culprit. The precision of Bundy's approach raised troubling questions. How had he moved so quickly from theory to practice? Investigators would later conclude that his shadow years had been his rehearsal, a time when he honed methods and overcame mistakes without drawing attention. By the summer of 1974, his system was perfected enough to evade entire task forces. The fear was palpable. Women were warned not to go out alone. Campuses held emergency meetings, and yet Bundy walked freely among the very communities that were terrified of the man they didn't realize was already in their midst. Even as panic spread, Bundy managed to live a life that appeared, on the surface, ordinary. He maintained romantic relationships, worked on political campaigns, and continued law studies intermittently. Friends and colleagues remembered him as ambitious, even likable. His girlfriends recalled tender moments alongside a darker side, mood swings, lies, and sudden vanishing acts. For law enforcement, the investigation was a labyrinth. Different states were handling separate cases with little coordination. Witness descriptions pointed to a man named Ted with a Volkswagen Beetle, but thousands fit that vague description. Composite sketches circulated, but they looked like any number of young men. What gave Bundy cover was his ability to adapt. He was meticulous in his appearance, blending into social circles that gave him credibility. In courtrooms and political offices, he looked like a rising star. At night, he became something else entirely. By 1975, suspicions began to sharpen. His name appeared on suspect lists, and some acquaintances even contacted police to raise concerns. Still, he avoided arrest, continuing to balance charm with deception. This dual existence became his signature, a law student by day, a predator by night. The two worlds overlapped, but rarely collided, until fate and a routine traffic stop began to unravel the mask. In August 1975, a Utah Highway Patrol officer stopped Bundy's Volkswagen. Inside were tools that raised immediate suspicion: masks, rope, and other items that suggested preparation for something more than travel. While the discovery wasn't enough for a murder charge, it was the beginning of his unraveling. Bundy was eventually charged with kidnapping and assault in Utah. During the pretrial investigations, more evidence linked him to a series of disappearances across multiple states. For the first time, the mask of the law student and aspiring politician was cracking. Yet even then, Bundy remained composed, using his intelligence and charm to delay proceedings. Then came the escapes. In 1977, Bundy leapt from a courthouse window during a hearing in Colorado, evading capture for 6 days before being recaptured. Months later, he escaped again, this time from jail, by sawing through a hole in the ceiling of his cell. He vanished for weeks. Bundy fled to Florida, and what followed was his most violent and public spree. Within weeks, he attacked again, this time leaving behind witnesses, survivors, and undeniable evidence. By the time police recaptured him in February 1978, he was no longer an unknown figure. He was one of the most wanted men in America. The escapes and renewed violence turned Bundy into a national headline, but the spectacle was just beginning. His trial would not only cement his guilt, but also turn him into a household name, a disturbing fusion of criminal and celebrity. In 1979, Ted Bundy's trial in Miami became the first nationally televised trial in U.S. history. The courtroom transformed into a stage, and Bundy, always conscious of appearances, played his role to perfection. Acting as his own attorney, he questioned witnesses, argued motions, and performed for the cameras. The media was captivated. Young women lined up to watch him, some convinced of his innocence, others fascinated by his charisma. Commentators debated how someone so normal could stand accused of such monstrous acts. Bundy fed on the attention, proposing marriage in court to a former co-worker, manipulating public perception even as the evidence against him mounted. Behind the theatrics, the trial revealed the truth. Forensic evidence tied him to multiple murders. Survivors gave harrowing testimony. Jurors saw the divide between Bundy's charm and the brutality of his actions. The guilty verdict was inevitable, and the death penalty followed. Yet Bundy's insistence on controlling his image remained. He gave interviews, maintained his innocence publicly, and hinted at crimes authorities had yet to uncover. He thrived on keeping investigators and the public guessing. And this is where the mystery of the shadow years re-emerged. Even as he faced execution, Bundy alluded to activities long before his confirmed crimes, leaving behind a chilling question. How many victims had there really been? The answer, investigators suspected, lay hidden in the years when Ted Bundy vanished from the record. As Bundy's execution date approached in the late 1980s, investigators pushed for full confessions. Bundy, ever strategic, offered pieces of the truth in exchange for delays. He began to discuss his pre-1974 years, the shadow period he had long left vague. What emerged changed the timeline of his crimes forever. Bundy admitted that his violent impulses didn't begin in Washington. They stretched back years earlier, during his transient period in the late 1960s and early 1970s. He traveled between Washington, California, Colorado, and other states, sometimes working briefly, sometimes drifting. During this time, he experimented with methods, approaching strangers, manipulating sympathy, learning how to isolate potential victims without leaving clear evidence. Cold cases from multiple states were quietly re-examined. Several investigators came to believe that Bundy's first attacks, and possibly murders, occurred during these years, long before the first confirmed incidents. Bundy never offered a complete list. He spoke cryptically, hinting at more, and leaving investigators with leads but no closure. The revelation reframed Bundy's story. He hadn't suddenly become a killer in 1974. Those early years were his proving ground, a time when he refined his techniques in anonymity. By the time his crimes became public, he was already experienced. The mask he wore wasn't new. It had been crafted in silence, perfected, far from the headlines. For law enforcement, it was a chilling reminder of how much they still didn't know. On January 24, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed in Florida. Outside the prison, crowds gathered, some celebrating, others simply witnessing the end of a figure who had dominated headlines for more than a decade. Bundy's final interviews mixed half-confessions with attempts to shift blame, revealing a man still trying to control the narrative until the last moment. After his death, investigators continued to connect unsolved cases to his movements, especially during the shadow period. While the exact number of his victims remains unknown, experts agree it is far higher than the official count. Bundy's story became a turning point for criminal profiling and interagency cooperation, highlighting how one individual's mobility and deception could outpace law enforcement of the time. Culturally, Bundy left a complicated legacy. His trial was the first to blend true crime and media spectacle on a national scale, setting a precedent for how serial cases would be covered in the future. He forced the public to confront uncomfortable truths, that evil doesn't always look like a monster, and that charm can mask extraordinary violence. In academic and criminological circles, Bundy is studied as a textbook example of psychopathy, manipulative, egocentric, lacking empathy. For many, his story serves as both a cautionary tale and a case study in how appearances can deceive. The mystery of his shadow years remains unsolved in full. Some files are still open, some families still without answers. Bundy's crimes ended with his death, but the questions he left behind continue to echo, a reminder of how darkness can hide in plain sight.